Hello, and welcome to the Chief Architect Ray Trace seminar. My name is Kayla, and I'm going to go ahead and walk you through some tips that I have learned over the years for ray tracing in Chief Architect. I'm going to open a plan that is already finished so that we can work with some cameras and take a ray trace of it. So ray trace is a photorealistic rendering technique in Chief Architect, and it has its own rendering engine. So instead of it being a live model, it's actually taking it out of the program and enhancing the lighting and materials to create a far more photorealistic image than some of our other rendering techniques. I'm going to start just by taking a full overview of this home. And I'm going to rotate around and use my scroll wheel, zoom in and out and pan around until I can get into a good view of this home. Now, before we run a ray trace, there are two very important elements to pay attention to, aside from the camera angle, which we just talked about. So first is to make sure that the lighting of the home is set the way that we want. So in particular, when we're working with an exterior view, what we want to make sure we're doing is adjusting the sunlight. Because right now the sun is hitting this home in such a way that we have some large shadows in kind of a primary area of this rendering. So what we're going to do is go under this menu to adjust sunlight, and I'm going to swap over to generic sun. I'm not using any real world sun data. I just want to get the shadows hitting this home in such a way that it lights it up nicely. So one way we could do that is just to select sun follows camera, but I'm going to get a little more specific on this. I'm going to adjust the tilt angle so that it's hitting the home, and then I'm going to have the sun coming from the side a little bit more. Other direction. There we go. And once I like the sun, I also can adjust the color, but the color is going to then tinge the entire plan. So if I made this color like a light yellow, all of my materials would take on a slight yellow hue as well. I'm going to leave that white, select OK. And if I was doing a nighttime scene, I would really want to make sure that I have enough lighting in the porch and any exterior lights. As it is, I might get a bit of a shadow in the porch here. So I will just add an additional light just to make sure. So we have the ability to add a light aside from a fixture. And what this does is it just highlights areas of the home that you want to draw attention to. So in this case, I want to make sure that that front door is not going to lose its light. I'll just click to place that light just to make sure that we have a little extra light coming on that front door, because the front door is a primary focus of this home. And once I have a lighting set, I'm going to just double check some of my materials. And some of this will be better to check after we run a ray trace, because sometimes we're going to see a material in the ray trace and determine that it has properties that we don't like or that we want to adjust slightly. But to adjust a material, I'm going to use the rainbow tool here. And I'm just going to click on a material in the home. And this will allow me to adjust the pattern or the texture. I'm not worried about any of those. What I'm concerned with are properties. Properties are how the light is interacting with the material. So in this case, we have a material with a high roughness, which makes sense because this is a fairly rough material if you look at it, and with a low specularity. So if I were to increase this, some sidings and some shingles have a bit of a sheen to them. They're a little bit more of a polished type material. And so if I wanted to increase that shininess, I could increase the specularity. And then let's talk a little bit about maps. So I'm not going to worry too much about most of them, but basically what each of the maps does is it gives 3D data to a 2D material. So a 2D texture is just a picture that's been pasted onto an object in the program. If we want to trick the eye into thinking that it has some 3D properties to it, we can set a map. And in particular, the one we're going to talk about today is a bump map. So what a bump map does is it pulls out the light areas of a texture and pushes back the dark areas, or it can do the reverse. This is a nice, easy one to work with because we can just take the texture source. So the texture source, this is the actual file, the picture that the program is using as the texture. And if we just take this texture source, so this material, and we just make it a bump map of itself, so I'm just going to paste it right here, Control C, Control V, and then hit Tab to apply it, you can see the application that it's had here. So if I remove that and then add it back in, you can see it's just increasing the depth, the grain of the materials, giving it a little bit more of a 3D texture to it. And then you can increase or decrease the scale. A standard scale is 0.01. You don't want to go too much higher than that because if we really increase this, you can see how much it's affecting the material. But somewhere around 0.1, 0.2, maybe a little bit less, will give a really good effect. And then when we select OK, we can see it applied to all of that texture throughout the plan. So bump maps are just a really easy way to improve your image, to pull out wood grains. I use them a lot on grasses, just to pull out the grass a little bit, make it look a little bit more 3D. And tiles and siding, anything that's going to not just be a flat image, I'll usually add a bump map to. Other materials to pay attention to in the program, anything that you want to be a little bit more shiny, like if this siding has a sheen to it, or if this trim has a sheen to it, then selecting that one, going to properties, and increasing the specularity or changing it over to a polished material can give it more of a shine. It tells the program that the sun is going to reflect a bit off of it. So now that we've adjusted our lighting and our materials, let's go ahead and start a ray trace. The ray trace tool is found right here, and we'll just click, open up the ray trace. There are different configurations, so built into the program by default, there's a default exterior and a default interior. Exterior and interior have very different lighting settings, so we definitely want to make sure that we're choosing an exterior or an interior depending upon the camera view that we're in. But I'm going to go ahead and launch the assistant. So this allows me to give the program a little bit more information before we start this ray trace. So as you saw, you can have multiple configurations. I usually have 4 or 5 built right into my default template. But launching the assistant will create a new configuration. So indoor or outdoor, we are outdoors, so we'll select that one. When you export an image of the home, if you're exporting a picture, it's going to ask you what dimensions you want to export that at. With a ray trace, when you start the ray trace, you're determining what the dimensions of that image are. So it's going to just pick up what the active window size is, so in this case about 1800 by 800 pixels. A typical large rendering for an HD monitor would be 1920 by 1080, but we usually like to start a little bit smaller. I have a test configuration for both interior and exterior that's just a nice small image. We want to test it out because, as I mentioned before, the ray trace is not a live model. So once we run the ray trace, we're not able to make any changes until we start the ray trace again. So making a test one, let's do maybe 500 pixels high, and I'm going to hit Tab. With retain aspect ratio, it means we're going to keep the same ratio of the image that we have selected. The smaller the image, the faster the ray trace is going to go, and that'll make a little bit more sense here in just a second if you haven't run a ray trace before. But we want to start with something that's going to get a good image of the home and get an idea of what we're looking at, and then we can apply those settings to the larger format ray trace. And I'll click Next. You can have different sun settings for your ray trace. Sunny is probably going to be the most typical, and we also set the sun in the plan itself. So if you choose one of these others, it is going to have a very different effect, your lighting, and they do have a color built into them as well. Take a look at some of that here in a second. But we're going to select Sunny. Go Next. So focal blur. This is when you are looking at an object in real life, the further away the object is, the more blurry it appears. This can kind of fake that effect. So the further away objects are, the more blurry they are. Now using focal blur will definitely increase the time that it takes to ray trace. So typically I do not select to have focal blur. The only time that I do is if I have a very large scene or if I've set up a neighborhood, or a couple times I've done something like a farm where there's a lot of things going on in the distance, then I will add a little bit of focal blur. I typically do not do lots of focal blur for anything. It's just going to increase the time for the ray trace more than I think is necessary. I'm going to select no focal blur, select next, and now we need to name it. So this is outdoor high quality, and we're going to call it small. Then I'll select finish, and now it's one of the options in my dropdown, and I'll go ahead and select to ray trace. So this is going to take a snapshot of the home, and it's going to export it into another tab, at which point it will begin the process of rendering it. So this is the screen that comes up initially. This just means that we haven't had a full pass yet. So down at the bottom, there's a status bar, and that's showing us how far into each pass we are. Every pass is going to increase the quality of the image. So pass 1 is going to be a fairly low quality image, and then the longer you let it sit, the more clear the image will become. So we'll let it sit until we get to pass 1, which should only take a minute. And I'm going to go ahead and pause until we do hit that first pass. Okay, so here is pass 1, and you can see it's a pretty grainy image right now, but we're going to let it go through a few more passes, and the longer that we let it sit, the higher quality the image is going to become. But you can already see we're getting a little bit of reflectivity in the windows, more than we had in our initial render. The shadows are more enhanced, and then we have some additional image properties that we can use once we get further along in the render. So I'm going to let this pause until we get to maybe 20 passes, and then we'll take a look again. So here we are, 20 passes in, and you can see the image is a lot clearer. Normally I would never allow a test ray trace to go quite this long. A few passes is usually enough to be able to tell whether, for instance, the materials are set the way we want, whether the lighting is looking how we want. But the longer you allow a ray trace to go, the sharper it becomes, and the more you can work with the image properties without them having a massive effect. Because if you're just a couple of passes in, when you're working with these image properties, which again are here, these are going to have a really, really drastic effect by moving them even a little bit when you're early on in a ray trace. And then the further along you go, the more nuanced these become. So you can increase or decrease them a little bit more, and they won't have such a huge effect. For an exterior ray trace, 20 to 30 passes is usually plenty. It does plateau at some point, so even though technically it's still increasing its rendering quality, it doesn't increase too much beyond that it's worth it going beyond 30 passes. 20 to 30 is usually perfectly fine for an exterior. And we'll look through some images here soon so you can see the progression of passes, and you can see what I mean about that plateauing. But these image properties, this is the last way that we really make sure that this ray trace is a good image that we're looking for. These are sort of like our photo editing, or if you work with anything like Photoshop, or even just taking a picture on your phone, the image properties are going to be very similar to that. For an exterior ray trace, the most important thing that you can do is to uncheck this use tone mapping, because it's going to really increase the sharpness of the image. I don't very often uncheck use tone mapping for an interior, although we are going to look at an interior view here in a second that is an exception to that. Brightness is not actually brightness in the sense of brightening the image. I don't mess with this too much, but what I do is just drop it down maybe to 49 or 48%. And if you take a look at the shadows and the dark areas of the home when I do this, if I just do 49% and hit tab, it just increases those shadows. So if you're not getting very good shadow line, sometimes just dropping down the brightness can help. And then contrast, this actually is going to function when we've unchecked use tone mapping. This is going to function a little bit more like brightness. But we do have some white areas of the home, so we probably don't want to up this too much. Let's try 60%. That's probably, we already have a pretty bright image. I'm going to go probably back down to 50. That's looking pretty good. And you could even try dropping this down just to see how that looks. Sometimes that's going to pull out the whites a little bit better. All of these are just preferences. So every image is going to take slightly different properties. We'll take a look at an interior ray trace here soon, and we'll adjust these settings a little bit more there. Saturation, this is going to have to do with the oranges and the greens in the plan. So when we're working with an exterior ray trace, upping this is going to really pull out any plants or grass, and normally it gets a little bit too fluorescent. For instance, if I go up to, let's do something crazy like 70%, and I'll hit tab, you can see how much more bright those plants became to where it's not quite a realistic effect at that point. So let's drop it back down to 60. There are some images where I even pull the saturation back if there's just too much color, more than I intended. The colors are going to look a little bit different in your ray trace than they are in your full overview, or just your standard render rather. Sometimes the saturation can help to move you more to a place of the color that you were originally intending. So those are the settings when you have use tone mapping unchecked. Now I'm going to move over to a ray trace that I started a while back, which is an interior ray trace. Actually, before we do that, let's pause this one. You can pause a ray trace and you can have multiple ray trace windows open like I do right here. And then whenever you want to restart one, if you get just a few passes in and want to pause it and start another, you can do that, and then you can resume it at any time. I'm going to go over to the interior one. So let's zoom out because this one I did a much larger image. And this one I am 98 passes through. This is almost 100 passes. This is way longer for an interior than I would ever normally let it go. For interior renders, typically 50 passes is when I call it quits. So 20 to 30 for the outside, and then I have to go a little longer for the interior ones. Typically they have more reflective materials, and those reflective materials are going to take a little bit longer. Let's take a look at the image properties here. So here, I may or may not uncheck tone mapping. This rarely looks good for an interior image. For some reason, for this particular one, it actually does work pretty well to uncheck tone mapping. But I'm going to leave it checked for right now so we can take a look at some of the other options. When we have tone mapping checked, intensity actually functions as brightness. So the higher the intensity, the brighter the image. So if we pull that up to 60 or 70%, you can see how much brighter that image becomes. When working in a scene like this that has a lot of white, we want to be careful about bringing the intensity or contrast too far up, because if I increase both intensity and contrast, you can see how quickly all of my white is going to get washed out, especially the definition of the cabinets here in the back, which are further and not a focal point of the scene, but still, you probably want to be able to see that they're cabinets and not just a white wall back there. Again, you can manipulate these as often as you want to. You can try a number of different images. What I usually will do is I will mess with these image properties. I'll try a few settings and then I'll export an image, and then I'll try a few different settings and I'll export an image. So once we assume that we like the image properties the way that they are, you can select OK, export it, name it, save it somewhere. Then you can create a new set of image properties. So let's actually pull the intensity way down. I do this sometimes. Pull the intensity down and then pull the contrast up. Intensity and contrast, sometimes they can work really well in tandem with each other. So sometimes I'll pull contrast back and intensity up, sometimes vice versa. The first image, we pulled both contrast and intensity up. It's just kind of, they're both working well with the light and they're both going to have different effects on the lighting. So those two in tandem with each other for an interior image can create very different effects. Softness, this is a pretty soft image, so let's just see what happens if we pull this all the way up to 90. So again, there's 90, and let's pull it back to 0, just so you can see the difference. You can see it's just softening the light quality. For an image like this, or anything that's like farmhouse or something that you want to have a really soft quality to it, pulling that softness up sometimes can create a really nice effect. Color correction, this has mostly to do with the blues, which includes whites, because whites have a lot of blue tones to them, and grays. This gray is going to have some blue tone to it. I usually have it either at 0 or 100. I mentioned earlier that sometimes the colors in a ray trace don't look the same as the color in a standard render. So in particular, if you have a blue room and it's just not the color that you chose, bringing color correction up to 100% can just bring it back to the tone that you initially chose. And then brightness, same thing as before. Let's drop it down to maybe 48% and hit tab. And that's just going to pull out some of the darker areas. We don't have a lot of darkness in this scene, but really all it did was it took all the blacks and it just kind of darkened them. And then saturation. So we have a lot of kind of yellows here, especially in that white and in the floors. So any movement on saturation, let's bring it up to 60%, is going to really change the color of the image. And we're not having as big of an effect as we would if we were only 5 or 10 passes in. If you start to mess with your image properties when you're only a few passes in, you are going to see really, really drastic changes. So let it sit for a little bit longer before you start working with image properties. And then with a test ray trace, normally you're not going to let it sit, as I mentioned, for 20 or 30 passes. It's just not usually worth your time. You can get a really good idea of the materials and the lighting before that point. Lighting kicks in after pass 2, so I do recommend waiting until pass 2 is complete just to make sure that all of your lighting is the way that you want. And then you can go ahead and exit out of it. In this case, this was a test one, so it wasn't large enough. It's not the size that I want, so yes, I do want to stop it, and I'm not going to save it anyway. This is actually a much larger image. You can export this one, and then you can go back to that camera view at any time, run another ray trace. You may want to do the outdoor high quality, which this one is 2300 by 1080. So one more note, the ratio of this image is much larger, or wider rather, than the ratio of a 1920 by 1080 HD image. I can always keep that in the back of my mind when I go to ray trace. I know that I'm going to have to cut off a few hundred pixels on either side, or a few hundred pixels total rather, on the width. So I make sure that I'm prepared for that so that I can crop down the image to be 1920 by 1080. You do not have to have your image at that size, obviously. That's just a very typical HD image. That's one that sits nicely on an HD monitor. So that's what we usually do, and all of our rendering images that you're going to see on our website are at that pixel width. And sometimes if you're working with particular social media sites, they have really particular image widths that they want. Instagram is one I can think of that really cut down on the width of an image. So keep that in mind because you may need to crop down like half of the image in order to fit on some of those sites that have some larger restrictions. Now, I just want to take a little bit of a look at some of the more advanced properties in these configurations. So we launched the assistant. What that's doing behind the scenes, if we click on Edit, this is the actual configuration. So here we have the image size. So if we chose the wrong pixels, we could always open it up here and change that. You can choose to have it save the image to a particular file. So every time it finishes a pass, it'll overwrite that image and just save it automatically for you. That way, if your computer shuts down or something happens, you'll still have that image at whatever pass that it was at the last time. You also can stop the ray trace at a particular duration's not usually going to make a whole lot of sense because you don't always know how long your image is going to take. The number of passes, probably at least 20 or 30 if you're doing an exterior high quality one. Or you can just have it be no limit, like the ones that I've done where you can just pause it at any time or exit out of it at any time. Then the lighting. So this panel has a lot to do with when we selected earlier the outdoor and sunny. That was affecting this particular panel. So the intensity of the outdoor light, every so often, if I'm not getting sharp shadows, I will increase the intensity, not by a lot. Even a little bit of adjustment can make a big difference to this image. The color that it's using, so we saw earlier that there was a color of the sunlight itself, and then here we have an environment light. that's the ray trace light. If you were to select sunset or evening, the color of the environment light changes a lot. Like an evening one is dark blue. Sunset one, I think, is something like orange, which is going to change the coloring of your image quite a bit. So even when I do select sunset, sometimes I'll come in here and I'll change the color that it's using just to tone that back a little bit. And then light sources, this is important. When you are looking at your camera, I'm going to cancel out of here just for a second. If you edit the camera that you're in, you can select how many lights you're using and you can choose a light set. So you can adjust your lights, choose what lights are turned on if you want just the ones that are set outside. So the deck lights that we have here, you can do that. And then when you go to ray trace, if you look at those advanced settings, so again, in the ray trace, we were looking at the outdoor high quality edit. You can choose a light set here as well, or you can just use the lighting of the active camera. So if you've already set a light set in your camera view, it'll use whatever light set you're using. So we had not had it set to have this porch light turned on, which is going to make a difference to the scene, especially if we were doing a nighttime ray trace. And then image properties. So this is exactly the same panel that we were looking at. So for my outdoor ray traces, I will just have use tone mapping turned off to begin with. So in that configuration, when we've edited it, it'll just by default have that turned off, so I don't have to go into image properties and uncheck that, because for pretty much every single outdoor ray trace, if it's not a nighttime scene, if it's a sunny scene, I am always going to turn off tone mapping. And for our exterior ray traces, I'm just going to talk about a couple more things that can help you create a really good quality image. One of them, and you can see it really clearly here, so we have a backdrop set in this design. And if you look back in the corner, you can kind of see the line that the terrain is hitting against that backdrop. That's not a prominent part of this image, so I'm not worried about that. But what you typically want to do is have plants set at the edge of your terrain and or a fence, because it's going to allow the model to seamlessly flow into the backdrop much better. What we don't want, if I just go ahead and delete that fence, we don't really want that stark line that then hits a backdrop, because it takes you out of the scene and makes it really clear that it's a render, where when we're working with ray tracing, we're trying to get as photorealistic as possible, which means we really like to have, if I undo that, a fence line so that it just more seamlessly flows into the backdrop. You also can choose to just not have a backdrop at all, and that can create a perfectly great effect. Having just sky works really well too. Or being zoomed in enough on the home. We have a nice small home here, so if we were really zoomed in, the backdrop really wouldn't make much of a difference at all. And then I do encourage you to work with some of those nighttime settings as well, because the nighttime settings sometimes can create a really, really fun effect, especially if you're working in a backyard and you have a lot of lantern lights. Being able to show your client what that's going to look like when you're having a party late at night and they have all of those lights turned on. Those nighttime settings can really look beautiful for that and have a great photorealistic effect. So I exported a number of ray traces of this home, and let's just go ahead and take a look at those just so we can recap some of the things we talked about. So here's the exterior ray trace that I ran earlier. This is different sunlight settings than we had, and this is just pass 1. So I'm just going to scroll through so we can see the progression. So this is pass 1. I mentioned that the lighting starts to kick in a little better at pass 2. You can see after pass 1 and 2, lighting just has more of an effect than it did in the first pass. And then if we go to pass 10, you can see it starts to clear up. Pass 30, we're actually not seeing that much of a difference unless if you look at the glass. Glass is going to have much more of an effect as we move along. So the difference between pass 30 and pass 50 is negligible. Basically, there's no difference there. That's why I mentioned it's just not really worth it to allow it to sit for an additional 20 passes. There's not a whole lot of change that's happening at that point. And then here's if we uncheck tone mapping. I increased the saturation a bit for this image. The image properties make a pretty big adjustment, because here's 50 passes without doing any image adjustments, and here's with those image property adjustments. It just makes quite a big difference in this design. And the same thing applies for an interior view. So here's pass 1, pass 2, pretty big lighting change, and then 10, 20, 30, and at this point we're not going to see too big of a difference. So here's 40, and then here's 100, and that one is with tone mapping unchecked. Here's with some of those softness properties turned up quite a bit, and then just another option. This one is with bloom turned on. So we haven't really talked about bloom, but when we're in a ray trace, we have the program open here. When we're in a ray trace, there's another adjust effect option. This is something you want to do only at the very end. But bloom is essentially the effect that happens around lights to give it a little bit more of a halo effect. This particular scene doesn't really require bloom, but nighttime scenes in particular definitely want to make sure you have bloom turned on. So those are some quick tips that I have for you on creating a good ray trace. Running that ray trace assistant and getting into the additional properties are really going to help you create a great photorealistic image. And don't be afraid after a couple of passes to exit out and start a new one. Adjust your lighting, adjust your materials, just to make sure that you're getting exactly the image that you're going for.